Amelia Earhart, A Flight of Mystery. It began as a flight around the world and ended as the greatest unsolved mystery in aviation history. On July 2nd, 1937, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan lifted off from Lae, New Guinea, bound for Howland Island. They never arrived. What followed was not just a search for a plane, but a search for meaning, a quest to understand how a voice could fade from the airwaves and yet echo for nearly a century. Amelia Earhart's world flight was more than adventure. It was symbol. She had become the face of modern aviation, of possibility itself. Each leg was a statement that the world was shrinking and that courage could cross its limits. But in the Pacific, the world expanded again. 1,000 miles of empty sea and one tiny speck of land called Howland Island, a target smaller than a comma on a map. Her last radio messages were clear but frantic. "We are on the line 157337. We are running north and south." It was 8:43 a.m. local time. Moments later, silence. What did that message mean? To some, it was a final bearing. To others, a desperate code. And to many, it was the beginning of the legend. For decades, investigators have tried to reconstruct those final hours, the fuel calculations, radio logs, weather reports, and magnetic headings. Each detail is a piece of a puzzle that never quite fits. Because the truth is not one story. It is several, each with its own logic and its own ghosts. There are numerous theories regarding the disappearance that have occurred over the years, each with its own components driving the mystery. We will look at the theories, the evidence and the new technologies that may help to unravel the mystery of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. Here are the theories we will look at in depth. 1. Crash and sink theory, official U.S. explanation. Summary: Earhart ran out of fuel searching for Howland Island and ditched in the Pacific. 2. Nikumaroro, Gardner Island. Theory. Summary: Earhart landed on the coral reef of Nikumaroro, Phoenix Islands, now Kiribati, and survived for a short time before dying as a castaway. Third Japanese capture theory. Summary: Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese after landing in the Marshall Islands, possibly on Mili or Saipan. 4. Spy or reconnaissance theory. Summary: Earhart was on a secret U.S. reconnaissance mission over Japanese territories for President Roosevelt. 5. New Britain, Papua New Guinea crash theory. Summary: Earhart turned back and crashed in the jungles of New Britain, near Rabaul. 6. Double life or identity theory. Summary: Earhart survived and returned to the U.S. under another name, often linked to Irene Bolam. 7. Pacific Ocean deep crash relocation hypothesis. Summary: Modern sonar mapping suggests the Electra may lie on the ocean floor along a different flight path or descent corridor near Howland. 8. Deliberate disappearance or secret return theories. Summary: She may have staged her disappearance or was rescued secretly and repatriated for political or personal reasons. We will then look at additional information that adds additional context and intrigue. So let's get right into it. The crash and sink theory, the official answer that wouldn't die. It is the simplest explanation, and for some, the only one that matters. Amelia Earhart ran out of fuel, lost sight of Howland Island, and crashed into the open Pacific. No conspiracy, no survivors, just bad luck in an unforgiving ocean. This is the crash and sink theory, the official line since 1937. Elegant in its simplicity, enduring in its convenience. But simple stories often hide complex silences. When the Itasca lost contact at 8:43 a.m., the Coast Guard assumed the Electra must have gone down within 100 miles of Howland. Within hours, the U.S. Navy dispatched a search fleet, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and flying boats sweeping thousands of square miles. They found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, no bodies. The Pacific had swallowed it all. And yet, the logic held. No evidence of survival meant proof of death, a grim calculus the bureaucracy could accept. The telegram search negative, probable crash at sea. That telegram became the cornerstone of history's verdict. It was tidy, it was final, and it spared everyone, the Navy, the government, even Putnam, from the chaos of uncertainty. To skeptics, the absence of proof is itself the answer. The Pacific is vast, currents brutal, corrosion relentless. To them, the crash and sink theory stands not because it's dramatic, but because it fits the statistics. Most missing aircraft of that era, once fuel ran out, met the same fate. Simple, predictable. But to others, that logic feels like surrender. If the Electra sank intact, why no debris within the search grid? If the impact was catastrophic, why no trace of fuel slick seen by Itasca observers for days after? And what of the 50 post-loss radio calls logged by amateur operators between July 2nd and July 7th? Transmissions that could only have occurred if the aircraft radio was intact and power still available. Those calls remain the theory's weak point. Inconvenient data quietly folded into footnotes. Their existence forces one question that even the crash and sink loyalists can't answer. If the Electra sank immediately, who was transmitting for the next 5 nights? The crash and sink theory has endured not because it solved the mystery, but because it gave the world permission to stop searching. It closed the file and opened the memorial. And in doing so, it became not a conclusion, but an escape, the kind of ending history loves most. In the absence of evidence, certainty becomes a comfort, but comfort is not proof. The Nikumaroro/Gardner Island theory, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGHAR, argues Earhart and Noonan, low on fuel, landed on Nikumaroro Island, 350 miles southeast of Howland. Its flat reef could support a landing at low tide. They survived briefly, but succumbed to dehydration, injury, or exposure. In 1940, 3 years after Earhart vanished, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher arrived to oversee the Phoenix Islands settlement scheme, a plan to colonize remote islands for the British Empire. On his arrival, local workers told him of something curious: a partial human skeleton found near the island's southeastern shore, along with pieces of a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and the remains of a campfire. Gallagher documented the find in a series of telegrams to his superiors in Fiji. The bones, he wrote, appeared to belong to a female of European type. The sextant box was marked with numbers linking it to Royal Navy patterns. He urged further investigation, believing, at least privately, that these might be the remains of Amelia Earhart. But bureaucracy is its own kind of ocean. The bones were sent to Fiji, examined by a colonial doctor, and quickly dismissed as male. No second opinion, no photographs, no preservation order. Eventually, the bones disappeared, misfiled or discarded, leaving only Gallagher's notes behind. The British files lay forgotten until rediscovered decades later by researchers sifting through dusty archives. And when modern forensic scientists applied the original measurements to computer analysis, something remarkable happened. The proportions fit a woman of Earhart's build: tall, athletic, and European. It was enough to reignite the mystery. By the 1990s, expeditions were returning to Nikumaroro. The island, then uninhabited, still held relics, a fragment of plexiglass matching aircraft window curvature, an aluminum panel once dismissed, but later traced to Lockheed production standards, and the remains of an old campsite where improvised tools and a woman's compact mirror lay in the sand. Even the local crabs, massive coconut crabs known to drag bones, became part of the story. Researchers speculated that any remains could have been scattered and consumed long before modern recovery teams arrived. To believers, the case was near closed. Earhart had landed safely on the reef, transmitted briefly until tides claimed her plane, and perished awaiting rescue. To skeptics, the evidence was too interpretive. No direct DNA match, no definitive wreckage, no irrefutable artifact. The aluminum piece known as 2-2-Phi-1, once hailed as proof, turned out to fit almost, but not perfectly. Almost, however, was enough to keep hope alive. Over time, the Nikumaroro theory became the most scientifically grounded, and yet the most debated, of all possibilities. Every new expedition found something, but never everything. And perhaps that is why it endures, because it offers evidence without closure, proof without peace. Gerald Gallagher's Lonely Island notes echo the same paradox that has haunted every search since 1937. Enough evidence to believe, not enough to prove. The bones may be gone, but the question they raised has never been buried. If she did land there, the island kept her secret well, absorbing her story into coral, tide, and rumor. And if she didn't, it reminds us that sometimes the most persuasive evidence in a mystery is not what we find, but what we choose to interpret. Evidence. In 1940, British colonists found a partial skeleton, a woman's size 9 shoe, Earhart's size, and a sextant box resembling Noonan's. The bones, lost in transit, were reanalyzed in 2018, showing a 99% match to Earhart's measurements. Artifacts include a freckle cream jar, Earhart used Dr. Barry's brand, plexiglass, and aluminum matching the Electra's repairs. Post-loss radio signals mentioned New York, possibly referencing a shipwreck on Nikumaroro's shore resembling NYC's skyline. In 2017, forensic dogs detected human remains under a wren tree. Pros: explains lack of ocean debris. Crabs could scatter bones. Cons: no DNA confirmation. Artifacts could belong to others. TIGHAR's 13 expeditions have found clues, but no definitive proof. The Marshall Islands theory. Captured in the Empire's shadow. When Amelia Earhart vanished in July 1937, the Pacific wasn't empty. It was occupied. Just 800 miles north of her intended course lay the Marshall Islands, administered by Imperial Japan under a League of Nations mandate. Officially, they were civilian territories. In reality, they were outposts, fortified, restricted, and off-limits to foreign eyes. That isolation would become fertile ground for rumor and for stories too persistent to ignore. In 1944, as U.S. Marines advanced through the Marshalls, whispers began circulating among islanders. A twin-engine aircraft had crash-landed or ditched near Mili Atoll years earlier. 2 foreign pilots, one a woman, had been taken into custody by Japanese officers. The capture theory begins where the radio silence ends. According to witnesses across the Pacific, Earhart's Electra may have landed or been forced down in Japanese-held territory, perhaps on Mili Atoll in the Marshalls or even further north near Saipan. From there, She and navigator Fred Noonan were allegedly taken into custody as suspected spies. In that tense pre-war climate, a foreign aircraft in restricted airspace was more than an accident. It was an incident. Over the years, dozens of local accounts surfaced. Marshallese witnesses claimed to have seen the silver plane on a barge, guarded by Japanese sailors. On Saipan, native witnesses told of two foreigners held by the Kempeitai, Japan's secret police, one of them a woman with short hair and European features. They described her as calm, defiant, and frightened. The lady pilot, they called her. One of the earliest witnesses was a young Marshallese girl named Josephine Blanco Akiyama. Living on Saipan during the late 1930s, she later claimed to have seen a Caucasian woman and man under guard, escorted by Japanese soldiers. The story, she said, was common knowledge among locals, the foreign flyers who came from the sky. Then came Bilimon Amaron, a respected Marshallese medic. In interviews decades later, he described treating a wounded white man, possibly Noonan, under supervision of Japanese naval personnel on Jaluit Atoll. He said the man's head was injured, the woman anxious but composed, both transported later aboard a vessel he believed bound for Saipan. His account never changed, even when questioned repeatedly by American journalists and researchers. There were others islanders who claimed to have seen a silver aircraft loaded onto a barge, a handful of wartime photographs allegedly showing the wreckage, and U.S. servicemen who said they'd heard the same tales from local interpreters during the island hopping campaigns. By the late 1940s, several U.S. servicemen returning from Saipan echoed those same stories. Marine Sergeant Thomas Devine wrote that he had seen a twin-engine aircraft under guard near Oslido Airfield, its engines partially dismantled. Another veteran, Everett Henson Jr., described a rumor spreading among his unit that the Japanese had executed 2 American flyers before the island fell. Most historians dismissed these claims as war stories, blurred by time and trauma. But the consistency between accounts, across language and decade, kept the whispers alive. By the 1960s, these fragments merged into a powerful narrative that Earhart and Noonan, off course and low on fuel, landed or were forced down near Mili. That the Japanese, suspecting espionage, detained them as prisoners, and that both ultimately perished under imperial custody, their fate hidden as a matter of wartime secrecy. The theory electrified post-war America. It fit perfectly into a Cold War imagination of cover-ups and lost heroes. Books, articles, and documentaries leaned on these testimonies to challenge the crash and sink narrative. One even claimed a blurry dockside photograph showed Earhart alive on Jaluit, surrounded by Japanese officials. For a moment, the world believed it might be true, but deeper scrutiny brought the story back to Earth. The famous photo? It predated her disappearance by 2 years. Military logs placed no foreign aircraft recovery in the region that month, and Japanese archives, now accessible to historians, hold no mention of such prisoners. Still, something lingers. Independent researchers have found fragments of U.S. intelligence cables hinting at rumors of 2 American flyers in Japanese custody, vague, unverified, but real enough to have crossed official desks. Whether myth, memory, or misdirection, the Marshall Islands story endures because it speaks to a deeper human suspicion that governments will hide mistakes behind secrecy, and that truth may survive only in the whispers of those who saw what they were not meant to see. If she did fall into the Empire's shadow, the silence that followed was not accidental. It was strategic. The flight that saw too much, the secret mission hypothesis. By the summer of 1937, the Pacific was not an empty ocean. It was a chessboard, one divided quietly between nations preparing for the next great war. While the world celebrated Amelia Earhart's flight as a triumph of peace and progress, others may have seen it as something else entirely. An opportunity. Japan's expansion through Micronesia was well underway. Under League of Nations mandate, it had fortified the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands, a chain that effectively turned the Pacific into a fortress. Yet to the rest of the world, these islands were closed territories. Foreign ships were denied entry. No photographs were allowed. No Western pilots were permitted to fly overhead. But Amelia Earhart's final route, her pivot from west to east, changed everything. It placed her directly over regions the U.S. Navy was desperate to observe. The switch from a westward circumnavigation to an eastward one had puzzled many historians. Officially, the explanation was weather and logistics, better headwinds, more favorable sunlight. But to others, it was strategic. Launching from Lae in New Guinea gave the U.S. a perfect pretext for reconnaissance over the Marshall Islands under the guise of a civilian record flight. After all, who would suspect the world's most famous aviatrix of being part of a covert intelligence operation? The rumor gained momentum after the war. Declassified Navy documents revealed a series of pre-1939 reconnaissance flights in the same region. And in one obscure memorandum, a proposed aerial survey under civilian cover was mentioned, though the names were redacted. For conspiracy theorists, the implication was clear. Earhart's Electra may have been carrying more than fuel and maps. Her Lockheed Electra 10E had been modified extensively before departure. Long-range fuel tanks, special radio wiring, and unused equipment space aft of the cabin. Was it merely for endurance, or something more? Some claimed it housed reconnaissance cameras, the same Fairchild type used in military mapping operations of the era. Others pointed to the presence of high-frequency radio gear that didn't match civilian requirements. If the flight carried photographic or signal intelligence objectives, it would explain two long-standing mysteries. Why so little coordination existed between civilian and military radio stations, and why the Navy's reaction to her disappearance was immediate and massive. Within hours of losing contact, a fleet mobilized, far faster than routine protocol. The USS Lexington, one of the Navy's largest carriers, steamed out with full escort. At the same time, orders were issued for absolute radio silence regarding her flight path. To some, that was compassion. To others, it was control. If Amelia had indeed photographed restricted islands, even unintentionally, Japan would have seen it as espionage. Several witness accounts in the Marshall Islands mentioned a plane landing under duress, guarded by Japanese personnel soon after. In this theory, she wasn't captured by chance. She was intercepted by design. Whether she was on an official mission or simply a pawn remains open to speculation. But the coincidence of timing is difficult to ignore. Just weeks before her disappearance, U.S. intelligence had quietly begun surveying the Pacific. 2 years later, those same regions would become frontline theaters of war. Was Amelia Earhart a symbol, or a sentinel who flew too close to the curtain? Some say the truth lies in classified archives still sealed. Others say there was no secret at all, that the story's allure stems not from fact, but from fear. The idea that even innocence can become intelligence when it enters the wrong sky. In the end, the secret mission theory remains what the Pacific itself is. Deep, layered, and unresolved. Yet it lingers because it makes sense of what logic alone cannot. The extraordinary effort of recovery, the silence of nations, and the inconsistencies buried beneath official versions. If her flight was purely civilian, history lost a pioneer. If it was more than that, history lost a secret. And sometimes those are the same thing. The Pacific keeps both kinds of silence. New Britain, Papua New Guinea. Crash theory, the Papua New Guinea jungle claim. A wild card theory claims Earhart crashed in the jungles of East New Britain Province, Papua New Guinea, over 1,000 miles west of Lae. In 1945, an Australian patrol reported a silver twin-engine plane with U.S. markings in the Gazelle Peninsula, approximately 4 degrees 30 minutes south, 152 degrees east, with no bodies. Locals shared stories of a white woman pilot surviving briefly. The 2024 Travel Channel documentary, Finding Amelia, and a July 2025 update spotlight, Expedition Amelia, a third trek launched in August 2025 by the Palm Springs Air Museum. Using LiDAR to map crash scars under the canopy, the team seeks metal fragments with excavators and detectors. Skepticism, PNG is far off the flight path, requiring impossible fuel reserves. The wreckage likely belongs to a World War II plane, common in the region. No artifacts confirm Earhart's presence, but the expedition continues. Double life or identity theory. The capture and the phantom identity. The woman who returned under another name. If Amelia Earhart survived, where did she go? That question haunts every theory, and none more hauntingly than the one that claims she lived on, hidden in plain sight. In 1965, author Joe Class published Amelia Earhart Lives, introducing the world to Irene Bolam, a New Jersey banker who, he argued, was the missing aviator living under an assumed identity. His theory was as dramatic as it was improbable that Earhart had been captured, survived, repatriated after the war under government secrecy, and given a new life as Bolam, who, Class claimed, bore striking resemblance to the lost pilot. The book caused a sensation and a lawsuit. Irene Bolam, very much alive and quite indignant, sued the publisher for defamation. Aviation historians rushed to her defense, producing documentation of Bolam's life long before Earhart's disappearance. The resemblance, it turned out, was the coincidence of two confident women of similar age and style, nothing more. Evidence: Bolam's 1970 lawsuit against a book claiming this, her physical similarities, and Earhart's friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt fuel speculation. Pros: explains no body or wreckage. Cons: Bolam died in 1982. DNA tests on relatives ruled out a match. It's largely dismissed as fantasy, but the idea stuck. People wanted to believe that Amelia had survived, that her story didn't end in the ocean. And once the possibility entered public imagination, it became immortal. Even decades later, fringe versions of the theory evolved. Some claimed she lived quietly in Japan under another name, others that she was forced to cooperate as a radio propagandist, a so-called Tokyo Rose. None of these claims ever produced verifiable evidence, but each captured a piece of psychological truth: our need to turn tragedy into transformation. Identity is a fragile thing, built on paperwork, memory, and the belief of others. Erase the records, alter the story, and a person can disappear even while still alive. The Irene Bolam controversy revealed less about Amelia Earhart's fate than about the culture that mourned her. We wanted a survivor because we could not accept a void. In an age of heroes, death was too ordinary an ending. Pacific Ocean Deep Crash Relocation Hypothesis: the Nauticos Deep Sea Hunts. While TIGHAR searched land, others searched the sea. Nauticos, a deep ocean exploration company, launched multiple expeditions near Howland Island, pursuing the crash and sink theory. Using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles, they mapped vast areas of seabed. Despite covering thousands of square miles, they found no trace of the Electra. The failure underscored the difficulty of the Pacific. Even with modern equipment, locating a small aircraft in miles-deep ocean is like finding a needle in a haystack. Robert Ballard's expedition. In 2019, famed explorer Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic, led an expedition to Nikumaroro. Partnering with National Geographic, Ballard used ROVs and sonar to scan the reef slope where the Electra might have slipped into deep water. The expedition found no conclusive evidence of the plane. Ballard, though disappointed, noted that the search was not exhaustive. The reef slope is vast and treacherous. His work kept the Nikumaroro theory in the headlines, deliberate disappearance, or secret return theories. Strategic opportunity. When Amelia Earhart's last confirmed transmission was logged at 8:43 on July 2, 1937, "We are on the line 157/337. The official story became one of urgent rescue. Ships and planes mobilized immediately. Radio operators across the Pacific began scanning for signals. Publicly, this was a humanitarian mission. Politically, it was an ideal pretext for the United States to deploy assets widely across the Central Pacific without raising diplomatic suspicion. The search pattern. The initial search concentrated northwest of Howland Island, based on the assumption Earhart had simply missed her target and exhausted her fuel nearby. But as hours turned to days, the search area expanded. Northwest of Howland, initial high-priority sweeps. Dash Phoenix Islands, added after Pan Am bearings pointed southeast. Dash Gilbert Islands. Edges of the search brought vessels and aircraft near areas closer to Japanese mandate zones. The Itasca, USS Colorado, and later other naval vessels fanned out over thousands of square miles. The political climate. This wide-scale search unfolded against a tense Pacific backdrop. In 1937, Japan had already withdrawn from the League of Nations, and suspicion was growing that it was fortifying its mandate islands, Marshalls, Marianas, Gilberts. These islands were officially closed to outside observation. Under normal conditions, U.S. naval deployments near these areas might have been provocative. But in July 1937, with Earhart missing, the U.S. Navy had a humanitarian reason to move forces, and no one could protest a rescue mission. Benefits of the search. 1. Operational readiness. The search provided a live exercise in long-range coordination of multiple ships and aircraft over the vast Pacific. The Navy tested communications, navigation, and supply logistics in real-world conditions. 2. Geographic familiarity. Ships and aircraft operating in the Phoenix and Gilbert regions gathered updated information about reefs, anchorages, channels, and currents. These details would later be valuable in planning bases and operations during World War II. 3. Demonstrated presence. The deployment showed U.S. capability and reach across the Pacific without directly challenging Japan. American ships in these waters were engaged in a rescue operation that drew global sympathy, not a military show of force. Intentional or opportunistic. There is no hard evidence that the search was orchestrated in advance as a covert survey mission, but the benefits were clear. If the flight's planning had already aligned with strategic interests, the search expanded those benefits. If the flight's disappearance was purely accidental, the search still offered an unexpected opportunity for political and operational gains. In either case, it would have been uncharacteristic for the Navy and Coast Guard to let such an opportunity pass without learning as much as possible. Linked to the Pan Am bearings. The Pan Am DF bearings that pointed to the Phoenix Islands gave the Navy a legitimate reason to move the USS Colorado south. That movement placed U.S. forces in and around the Phoenix Group, areas of emerging interest for colonization and strategic claims. A public story, a strategic gain. Publicly, the Earhart search was exactly what it appeared to be, a desperate effort to find a missing aviator. But in the larger context of 1937, it was also a demonstration of U.S. reach, a rehearsal of Pacific operations, and an intelligence gathering opportunity, all under the most sympathetic possible cover. The bearings that never aligned, navigation and direction finding failures. To understand how Amelia Earhart could vanish in daylight, within range of an awaiting ship, we have to understand how 1937's most advanced navigation system failed her. Not once, but repeatedly. Fred Noonan was among the best celestial navigators alive, the man who had charted Pan American Airways' pioneering Pacific routes. He relied on two instruments, a sextant and his sense of time. From the air, he used the sun and stars to plot lines of position, imaginary highways across the ocean. At dawn, one of those lines ran directly through Howland Island on the heading 157-337. When Amelia radioed that phrase, "We are on the line 157-337, it meant she believed they were flying along it. But by then, more than 2 hours had passed since the sunshot that created it. The line had moved with the planet's rotation, leaving them flying a ghost path through empty sky. That single misunderstanding defined the rest of their flight, and the tragedy that followed. Noonan's calculations were good. His timing was not. Each minute of error translated to miles of displacement, and without a working two-way communication link, the Electra was navigating in a vacuum of assumption. Meanwhile, the Itasca, waiting at Howland, had its own blind spots. Its direction-finding antenna was optimized for lower frequencies, while Earhart's voice transmissions were higher. When she called, they heard her loud and clear, but she couldn't get a bearing. When they broadcast back, she couldn't hear them at all. Most calls on a frequency she could not receive. They were two operators shouting across frequencies that refused to meet. To make matters worse, a chain of Pan American Airways stations, stretching from Makapu in Hawaii to Midway and Wake, actually did receive Earhart's post-loss signals. Each station used radio direction finding equipment to take bearings on the transmissions. The lines, when plotted on a map, converged not near Howland, but hundreds of miles to the south-southeast, directly toward the Phoenix Islands. If those bearings were correct, she might have been alive and transmitting from a reef near Gardner Island, but the Navy never used them. Why? Because those bearings were unofficial. They came from a commercial airline, not from the military chain of command. Accepting them meant admitting that the original search area had been wrong. Instead, they were filed under unverified and quietly shelved. Suppressed, not mitigated. It was one of the greatest missed opportunities in modern search history. Had the fleet turned south instead of northwest, they might have reached Nikumaroro within days. Instead, they scoured 150,000 square miles in the opposite direction and found nothing. Later analyses by radio engineers would reveal that the Itasca's equipment itself had calibration errors. Its own bearings could have been off by tens of degrees. The sun's ionized rays at dawn added another layer of distortion. HF waves bent, refracted, and bounced unpredictably, creating what operators call skip zones, dead regions where signals vanish entirely. Ironically, Earhart may have been broadcasting into one of those very zones, her calls skimming over Howland and landing hundreds of miles away. To the Itasca, she was close, almost overhead. To the physics of radio, she might have been far beyond their reach. The world remembers her final message as proof of nearness, but to engineers, it reads like the echo of distance. We are on the line 157337, running north and south. That phrase, misunderstood for decades, wasn't a navigational instruction. It was a plea, a coded way of saying, we are lost along the only line we know. Every link in her radio chain, from Ley to Howland to the Navy's search ships, relied on systems that had never been tested together. Each worked in isolation, but failed in unison. No one was lying. No one was incompetent. They were simply misaligned, humans and machines operating on different frequencies. And in that disconnect lies one of the story's cruelest ironies. Amelia Earhart wasn't flying into the unknown. She was flying into a silence we built ourselves. In the end, all we know for certain is that Amelia Earhart took off from Ley, New Guinea, on the morning of July 2nd, 1937, and vanished somewhere between the limits of technology and the edges of human ambition. Everything else is interpretation. The crash and sink theory gave us closure. The Gardner Island hypothesis gave us evidence. The capture and identity stories gave us drama. And the secret mission theory gave us motive. Each version speaks not only to what may have happened, but to who we are. Because beneath the data, coordinates, and radio logs lies something more personal, a reflection of our need for meaning. We search not just for a plane, but for certainty. In a world where even the most famous among us can disappear without a trace. When investigators reviewed the radio logs, they found chaos disguised as order. Amateur operators hearing phantom voices, direction-finding stations reporting impossible bearings. And yet, from those fragments, a pattern emerged, faint, human, insistent. Someone was calling, someone who believed rescue was still possible. Perhaps that's why the story continues to haunt, because somewhere inside us, we imagine that voice still echoing across the frequencies of history. In every great mystery, there is a truth and a mirror. The truth is data, cold, measured, immutable. The mirror is emotion. What we project onto that data, what we need it to mean. For Amelia Earhart, the mirror has outlasted the evidence. Was she a victim of circumstance? A brave pilot lost to miscalculation? Or was she part of something larger? A chapter of pre-war secrecy disguised as exploration. History leaves both doors ajar, inviting each generation to step through its own preferred version. That line, 157 to 337, has become more than navigation. It's a metaphor, a line across time between hope and despair, fact and faith. For decades, explorers have followed it, literally and symbolically, from Howland to the Phoenix Islands and beyond. Each expedition carries radar, sonar, drones, and dreams. Each returns with fragments, aluminum, bone, glass, objects that might be proof or coincidence. Yet the greatest discovery is not material. It's the realization that mystery itself has become her legacy. To some, she remains the patron saint of aviation, a woman ahead of her time, daring the limits of endurance. To others, she's a cipher, a vessel for secrets lost between governments. And to millions, she is simply a reminder that courage can vanish into the same horizon it conquers. The Pacific does not give up its dead easily, nor does it surrender its myths. Every few years, new expeditions promise answers. Another sonar contact, another piece of aluminum, another theory reborn in the glow of curiosity. But beneath the machinery and the science lies something poetic, that her disappearance has become a kind of conversation between fact and faith, between what we know and what we still want to believe. She set out to circle the world, and instead she circled history, an orbit without return still drawing us in. It's easy to forget that she wasn't flying for records or riches. She was flying for connection, to prove that the world could be crossed, linked, unified. In that sense, she succeeded, because today, nearly a century later, her voice still connects us, across disciplines, across continents, across generations of dreamers asking the same question. Where did Amelia Earhart go? Perhaps the better question is, why does she still matter? Because in her story, we see the blueprint of human curiosity itself. We explore, we risk, we lose, we search again. The horizon recedes, but the pursuit continues. It's not the answer that endures, it's the pursuit. Whether she lies deep beneath the sea, rests unmarked on coral, or was lost to time and secrecy, Amelia Earhart remains suspended between myth and memory. Not gone, merely unseen. Like a signal from beyond range, like a voice faintly repeating across static. We are on the line, 157-337. Somewhere between truth and imagination, that line still exists. And maybe that's where she remains, flying the invisible corridor between what we know and what we dare to believe.